Hey guys, tonight we're descending into one of history's most brutal workplaces, a medieval salt mine. Picture this. You're standing at the edge of a gaping hole in the earth, watching other miners disappear into what looks like the mouth of hell itself. The wooden pulley system above you groans under the weight of human cargo, and somewhere far below, you can hear the echo of pickaxes striking salt and stone, mixed with the occasional scream that may or may not be from excitement about finding a particularly nice chunk of rock salt. You probably won't survive this adventure, but that's exactly why we're taking it from the safety of your bed tonight. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop a comment letting me know where you're listening from and what time it is there. I love seeing our global community of insomniacs and history buffs unite in the pursuit of weird medieval knowledge. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're living in the year 1347, somewhere in the Alpine regions where salt deposits run deep beneath the mountains. Salt isn't just a seasoning, it's literal currency, more valuable than silver in some regions because it preserves food and keeps entire populations from starving through winter. The local lord has conscripted you into service at his salt mine, and refusing isn't really an option unless you're particularly fond of having various body parts removed in creative ways. The descent begins with you being fitted into a crude harness made of rough hemp rope that immediately starts chafing against your medieval undergarments, which, let's be honest, weren't exactly designed for comfort to begin with. The rope burns against your skin as you're lowered into darkness so complete it seems to have physical weight. Modern cavers talk about cave darkness, but medieval miners experience something far worse. Darkness mixed with the knowledge that there's no electric light switch, no rescue team with modern equipment, and definitely no OSHA regulations to protect you from whatever horrors await below. The walls around you transform from familiar earth and stone into something alien and crystalline. Salt formations jut out like frozen lightning, and your torch? Yes, an actual flaming torch because electricity won't be invented for another few centuries. Casts dancing shadows that make everything look like it's moving with malevolent intent. The temperature drops noticeably with each foot of descent, and you realize that your woolen clothing, perfectly adequate for surface life, will soon become a soggy, freezing burden in the humid underground environment. Historians still argue whether medieval salt mines were primarily staffed by convicted criminals, indentured servants, or simply the desperately poor, but they all agree on one thing. Life expectancy underground was measured in months, not years. The lucky ones died quickly from cave-ins or gas explosions. The unlucky ones lived long enough to develop the full spectrum of mining-related diseases that would slowly transform their bodies into something barely recognizable as human. As you reach the bottom of your descent, approximately 200 feet below the surface, your feet touch solid ground for what might be the last time in your short remaining life. The air here isn't just stale, it's aggressive. It attacks your lungs with the fury of a medieval plague, carrying microscopic salt particles that immediately begin their work of turning your respiratory system into something resembling a poorly maintained salt shaker. You take your first full breath of mine air and immediately understand why miners developed that distinctive hacking cough that served as both greeting and goodbye in this underground world. The torch in your hand illuminates a maze of tunnels stretching out in multiple directions, each one disappearing into darkness so profound it seems to swallow light itself. Somewhere in the distance, you can hear the rhythmic striking of metal on stone, punctuated by the occasional groan or curse in whatever local dialect the other miners speak. These sounds become your new soundtrack, replacing the familiar noises of surface life, birds singing, wind rustling through trees, children playing in village squares, with the industrial symphony of medieval extraction capitalism at its most brutal. Your first breath in the depths teaches you that air, something you've taken for granted your entire life, has become your enemy. The atmosphere down here isn't just different. It's actively hostile, like breathing through a wet wool blanket that someone has seasoned with crystallized suffering. Each inhalation brings a cocktail of salt particles so fine they slip past your body's natural defenses and begin their immediate assault on your lung tissue. Within minutes, you're developing what miners cheerfully call the underground cough, which sounds exactly like what you'd expect from someone trying to breathe underwater while gargling gravel. The salt dust isn't your only aerial adversary. Medieval mines were notorious for their methane pockets, natural gas deposits that could turn your torch from a helpful light source into an impromptu cremation device. Modern miners have gas detectors and safety protocols. Medieval miners had the time-honored tradition of sending the newest guy with a torch into suspicious-looking tunnels and seeing if he came back out or if there was suddenly a lot more screaming and significantly less newest guy. Historians still argue whether mine explosions were more feared than cave-ins, but most agree that both were preferable to the slow death of lung disease that awaited everyone who survived their first month underground. The humidity down here approaches tropical levels, which might sound pleasant until you realize you're wearing multiple layers of wool and leather that weren't designed for this climate. Your clothes begin absorbing moisture from the air while simultaneously soaking up your sweat, creating a personal ecosystem of dampness that will soon become a breeding ground for various fungi and bacteria that medieval medicine can't even name, let alone treat. You're basically marinating yourself in your own clothing while breathing air that's roughly 30% salt particles and 70% despair. But wait, there's more. The mine atmosphere also features delightful trace amounts of hydrogen sulfide, giving everything a subtle aroma of rotten eggs mixed with existential dread. This gas, in addition to smelling like Satan's breakfast, can cause headaches, nausea, and in higher concentrations, unconsciousness followed by death, which, given your current circumstances, might actually be considered a mercy. Medieval miners called it the stink damp, because nothing says professional workplace terminology like calling deadly gas damp and moving on with your day. Your torch flame begins behaving strangely in this alien atmosphere, flickering and changing colors in ways that would fascinate a modern chemist but terrify anyone whose life depends on that flame for navigation and safety. The flame's color shifts from orange to blue-green when it encounters different gas pockets, creating an inadvertent early warning system that miners learned to read like a life or death mood ring. Blue flames meant methane, dim, struggling flames meant carbon dioxide buildup, and no flame at all meant you had approximately 30 seconds to make peace with whatever deity you favored before joining the growing collection of miner skeletons that decorated the deeper tunnels. The air pressure itself feels different down here, pressing against your eardrums and making every sound echo strangely through the tunnel system. Your voice, when you try to call out to other miners, comes back transformed, hollowed out and stretched thin, as if the mine is stealing parts of your words and keeping them for its collection of lost things. The acoustic properties of salt-lined tunnels create an effect that makes whispered conversations carry for hundreds of yards while simultaneously muffling screams to barely audible whimpers. A cruel joke of physics that ensures help is always just out of earshot. Remember that fresh morning air you breathed on your way to this nightmare job? Your lungs are already nostalgic for it, sending increasingly desperate signals to your brain that something has gone terribly wrong with your life choices. The salt particles are beginning their work of crystallizing inside your respiratory system, creating tiny cuts in your lung tissue that will never properly heal as long as you continue breathing this mineral soup. Each cough brings up a mixture of blood, salt, and whatever medieval medicine would eventually classify as lung bits, though they'll probably just blame it on an imbalance of humors and recommend leeches. The veteran miners you can see working in the distance have developed a distinctive breathing pattern, short, shallow breaths that minimize their exposure to the worst of the atmospheric assault. They move with an economy of motion that speaks to hard-earned experience with an environment that punishes every unnecessary exertion with a corresponding increase in respiratory distress. These are the survivors, the ones who've learned to work with the mine's hostile atmosphere rather than against it, though working with, in this case, means dying slightly more slowly. Your hands wrap around the tools that will either extract salt or extract your soul from your body, possibly both simultaneously. The pickaxe thrust into your calloused palms weighs roughly 15 pounds and represents the pinnacle of medieval mining technology, which is to say it's essentially a sharp rock attached to a wooden stick with all the ergonomic consideration of a medieval torture device. The iron head has been forged by someone who clearly believed that comfort was for wealthy merchants, not underground laborers, and the handle is worn smooth by countless hands that came before yours, most of whom are now permanent residents of the mine's deeper, darker sections. The wooden shovel accompanying your pickaxe looks deceptively simple until you realize it's designed to move chunks of salt that weigh more than a medieval child. And you'll be doing this thousands of times per day in conditions that would make a dungeon seem spacious and well ventilated. The shovel blade is reinforced with iron strips, because regular wood tends to disintegrate when subjected to the kind of punishment that medieval salt extraction demands. The handle shows clear evidence of being chewed by desperate miners during their brief rest periods, creating a textured grip that's part tool maintenance, part stress relief, and part gradual wooden consumption for its trace nutritional value. These tools weren't just crude by modern standards. They were specifically designed to be disposable, much like the miners who wielded them. Medieval toolmaking philosophy centered around creating implements that could be quickly and cheaply replaced when they broke, which happened roughly as often as miners needed medical attention, meaning constantly. The iron for your pickaxe was smelted using techniques that produced metal with all the consistency of medieval weather forecasting, resulting in tools that might last months or shatter on their first contact with particularly stubborn salt deposits. Historians still argue whether medieval mining tools were intentionally made uncomfortable to discourage worker laziness, or if the discomfort was simply an unavoidable byproduct of primitive metallurgy. But the practical effect remains the same. Every swing of your pickaxe sends vibrations through your arms that feel like being repeatedly struck by a very small, very persistent lightning bolt. Your shoulders will be screaming within the first hour, and by day's end, your entire upper body will feel like it's been used as a practice dummy by enthusiastic knights in training. The pickaxe technique you're expected to master involves a combination of overhead swings, side strikes, and desperately creative angles designed to attack salt formations from whatever direction seems least likely to result in immediate injury. There's no formal training program, no safety manual, and definitely no workers' compensation insurance. You learn by watching other miners and trying not to die during the educational process. The veteran miners make it look almost graceful, their movements economical and precise. But that's only because the ones who weren't graceful, economical, and precise are now contributing to the mine's impressive collection of cautionary skeletons. Your wooden bucket, the final member of your underground tool family, represents medieval engineering's answer to the question, what's the most inefficient way to move heavy materials through narrow, unstable tunnels? The bucket holds roughly 20 pounds of salt when full, which means you'll be making approximately 50 trips per day to meet your quota. Assuming you don't collapse from exhaustion, get crushed by falling rocks, or succumb to any of the mine's other creative methods of worker attrition. The rope attached to your bucket is hemp, chosen for its availability rather than its strength, and has the disconcerting tendency to fray at the most inconvenient moments, usually when you're climbing vertical shafts with a full load of salt and a long way to fall. Medieval rope technology hadn't quite mastered the concept of safety factor, operating instead on the principle that if the rope held the last guy, it would probably hold you too, unless it didn't, in which case you'd become an object lesson for the next guy. Tool maintenance in medieval salt mines consisted primarily of hoping your equipment lasted longer than you did. There were no replacement parts, no warranty programs, and no customer service departments. When your pickaxe handle cracked, You wrapped it with whatever rope or leather you could scavenge and kept working until it completely failed, at which point you either improvised a replacement or joined the mine's growing population of unemployed due to death former workers. The salt itself actively conspires against your tools, its corrosive properties gradually eating away at iron components while the constant impact slowly loosens joints and connections throughout your equipment. Your pickaxe becomes progressively less effective as the salt deposits strip away microscopic layers of metal, eventually transforming your once sharp tool into something resembling a very expensive club with delusions of grandeur. Welcome to the most brutal corporate hierarchy in human history, where your position is determined not by talent, education, or connections, but by how long you can avoid dying in spectacularly unpleasant ways. At the bottom of this social ladder, which is where you're starting, congratulations, are the tunnel rats. Miners so new and expendable that they're assigned to the most dangerous jobs with the cheerful expectation that most of them won't survive long enough to develop expensive habits like eating regularly or breathing without pain. As a fresh tunnel rat, your primary responsibility involves crawling through spaces so narrow that medieval torture chambers would consider them inhumane, armed with nothing but your inadequate tools and the statistical certainty that your predecessor in this role is currently contributing to the mine's sediment layer. You're expected to extract salt from areas too dangerous, too unstable, or too haunted by previous mining accidents for more valuable workers to risk their lives. Think of yourself as a medieval canary, except instead of detecting gas, you detect death by experiencing it firsthand. Above you in the hierarchy are the regular shaft workers, miners who've survived long enough to earn the privilege of working in slightly less suicidal conditions. These veterans have developed the 1,000-yard stare common to medieval laborers who've seen too much and expect to see more before their inevitably premature deaths. They're distinguished by their extensive collection of scars, their ability to predict cave-ins through subtle changes in air pressure, and their complete lack of interest in learning your name since you probably won't be around long enough to make the effort worthwhile. The shift supervisors occupy the middle management layer of this underground nightmare, responsible for ensuring quotas are met while maintaining plausible deniability about the methods used to achieve those quotas. These are typically former miners who've survived long enough to develop leadership qualities like still having most of their limbs and able to count salt loads without hallucinating from gas exposure. Their job involves making decisions that balance productivity against worker mortality, usually by prioritizing productivity and assuming mortality will sort itself out naturally. Historians still argue whether medieval mine supervisors were genuinely sadistic or simply responding to economic pressures from above, but the practical effect for you remains the same. They view workers as slightly more valuable than the tools you carry, but significantly less valuable than the salt you extract. Your life has been assigned a specific monetary value, calculated based on replacement cost versus training investment, and that value is disturbingly low. At the apex of this hierarchy sits the mine owner, typically a local nobleman who views the entire operation as a particularly lucrative form of entertainment. These aristocrats occasionally visit their mines with the enthusiasm of tourists exploring exotic lands, protected by armed guards and carrying scented handkerchiefs to ward off the unpleasant realities of underground extraction. They speak of miners in the same terms they discuss livestock, useful resources that require minimal investment and produce maximum return until they inevitably break down and need replacement. Your position in this hierarchy isn't just about work assignments. It determines everything from your sleeping arrangements to your food rations to your medical care. Assuming medical care exists at all for someone of your social standing, tunnel rats sleep closest to the mine entrance, which means they're first to respond to emergencies, first to face any threats that emerge from the depths, and first to die when things go wrong. It's like being the designated point man in a war where the enemy is physics and the terrain is actively trying to kill you. The social dynamics between hierarchy levels create additional layers of brutality beyond the mine's natural hazards. Higher-ranking miners protect their positions by ensuring lower-ranking miners don't survive long enough to become competition, while supervisors maintain discipline through creative applications of violence that would make professional soldiers uncomfortable. The result is a workplace where your colleagues are almost as dangerous as the environment, and cooperation exists only when mutual survival depends on it. Moving up in this hierarchy requires surviving long enough to demonstrate competence while simultaneously eliminating competition through methods ranging from workplace accidents to more direct approaches involving pickaxes and dark tunnels. The few miners who manage to advance do so by developing skills in areas that have nothing to do with salt extraction and everything to do with medieval survival politics, which basically means learning to kill people more creatively than they're trying to kill you. Your daily interactions with this hierarchy reinforce your expendable status through 1,000 small humiliations. Being assigned the most dangerous tasks, receiving the smallest food portions, getting blamed for accidents that couldn't possibly be your fault, and being beaten for failing to meet impossible quotas set by people who've never held a pickaxe in their lives. Your body is about to experience what medieval physicians would have called a severe disruption of natural humors, but what modern science recognizes as the complete collapse of every biological system designed to keep humans functional. Welcome to the medieval miner's schedule. 16 hours of backbreaking labor in conditions that would violate every workplace safety law ever written, followed by 8 hours of restless sleep in conditions that would violate every human decency standard ever imagined, repeated daily until death mercifully intervenes. The workday begins at what you might generously call dawn, except you'll never see actual sunlight again. So dawn becomes a theoretical concept marked by the sound of supervisors beating on metal pots and shouting threats in whatever colorful medieval dialect the local region has developed for expressing workplace motivation. Your circadian rhythm, that delicate internal clock that has regulated human sleep patterns since the dawn of time, immediately stages a revolt against this new reality, flooding your system with stress hormones and confusion signals that make you feel like you're perpetually suffering from the world's worst case of jet lag. Medieval miners worked by torchlight, which sounds romantic until you realize that torch flames flicker constantly, creating a strobing effect that would trigger seizures in modern epileptics and causes medieval miners to develop what contemporary medical texts describe as the underground madness, a condition characterized by hallucinations, paranoia, and the tendency to swing pickaxes at shadows that may or may not contain actual threats. Your eyes strain constantly to focus in this dancing, uncertain light, developing a permanent squint that becomes part of your underground identity, along with the cough, the limp, and the tendency to flinch at unexpected sounds. The 16-hour shift isn't just long, it's structured to maximize human suffering while extracting maximum salt productivity. You work in 2-hour sprints followed by 15-minute breaks, except the breaks are spent hauling salt loads to the surface. So they're really just different types of exhausting labor disguised as rest periods. During these breaks, you climb vertical shafts using rope ladders that sway ominously under your weight while carrying buckets of salt that seem to grow heavier with each trip, as if the mineral is gradually absorbing your life force and converting it into additional weight. Historians still argue whether medieval work schedules were based on productivity studies or simply designed to kill workers before they could organize labor unions. But the effect remains the same. Your body enters a state of constant breakdown that makes normal healing impossible. Muscles don't have time to recover between shifts, cuts and scrapes accumulate daily without proper healing time, and your skeletal system begins the gradual process of compression and deformation that gives veteran miners their distinctive hunched posture. Your sleep schedule becomes a cruel joke played by biology on someone whose life has already become sufficiently joke-like. The 8 hours between shifts are spent in underground dormitories carved directly into the salt walls, where you sleep on straw pallets that provide roughly the same comfort as sleeping on a pile of medieval agricultural tools. The salt walls continuously weep moisture, creating a humidity level that turns your bedding into a damp, moldy breeding ground for bacteria that medieval medicine can't identify but your immune system recognizes as hostile invaders. The constant darkness plays havoc with your brain's production of melatonin and serotonin, creating a chemical imbalance that manifests as depression, anxiety, and what medieval physicians called melancholia of the deep places, a condition that modern psychiatrists would recognize as severe seasonal affective disorder complicated by post-traumatic stress and occupational hazard exposure. You begin experiencing vivid nightmares about cave-ins, flooding, and being buried alive, which isn't really paranoia when you're living in an environment where all of these things happen regularly. Your digestive system rebels against the combination of terrible food, irregular eating schedules, and constant physical stress, developing what medieval medical texts describe as miner's gut, a condition involving chronic diarrhea, stomach pain, and the inability to properly digest the limited nutrition available in underground rations. This creates a vicious cycle where you need more calories to fuel your brutal work schedule but can't properly process the calories you manage to consume. Remember that concept of weekends? Medieval miners worked 7 days a week because salt deposits don't observe religious holidays, and neither do the lords who own them. Your only breaks from this schedule come when you're too injured to work, too sick to stand, or too dead to complain about working conditions. The lucky miners get Sundays off to attend church services where they can pray for deliverance from their current circumstances. Though medieval theology suggests that being a salt miner might actually be divine punishment for sins committed in a previous life, the psychological effects of this schedule create a form of learned helplessness where you stop planning for the future because the concept of future becomes meaningless when your entire existence is measured in shifts survived rather than days lived. Your personality gradually erodes under the constant stress, leaving behind a hollow shell of reflexes and survival instincts wrapped around whatever remains of your original human identity. Water, the source of all life, becomes your most intimate enemy in the underground realm where physics and geology conspire to demonstrate nature's twisted sense of humor. Medieval salt mines were essentially elaborate death traps disguised as commercial enterprises, and nothing illustrated this better than the mine's relationship with water, a relationship best described as actively homicidal with occasional moments of merely life-threatening. Your first encounter with mine flooding comes not as a dramatic wall of water like you might see in modern disaster movies, but as a subtle seepage that begins with damp walls and ends with you drowning in a tunnel, while your screams echo uselessly through passages that no rescue team will ever navigate in time. The water doesn't announce its arrival with sirens and evacuation orders. It simply appears, following underground channels and fissures that medieval engineering couldn't detect, predict, or prevent. The salt deposits themselves create a geological nightmare that turns water from life-sustaining liquid into a corrosive agent capable of dissolving rock, metal, and human flesh with equal enthusiasm. As groundwater seeps through salt layers, it becomes a concentrated brine solution so caustic that brief contact burns exposed skin, and prolonged exposure creates wounds that refuse to heal properly in the mine's humid, bacteria-rich environment. You're essentially working in a giant pickle jar where you're gradually becoming the pickle. Medieval mine drainage systems consisted primarily of hoping the water would go somewhere else and occasionally digging channels that redirected flooding towards sections of the mine where fewer important people were working. There were no electric pumps, no sophisticated engineering solutions, and definitely no emergency response protocols beyond run toward the surface and hope you're faster than the water. The drainage channels, when they existed at all, were maintained by the same expendable workers who were expected to continue working even as water levels rose around their ankles. Historians still argue whether medieval mine owners were aware of the flooding risks or simply chose to ignore them as acceptable business expenses. But contemporary records suggest a pragmatic approach best summarized as workers are cheaper than waterproofing. The economic calculations were brutally simple. Losing a few miners to flooding cost less than implementing comprehensive drainage systems. especially when replacement workers were readily available from the surrounding population of desperate peasants. Your daily work routine includes the charming responsibility of monitoring water levels while simultaneously trying to extract salt quotas that assume dry working conditions. This means you're constantly making life or death decisions about whether that small puddle represents normal mine seepage or the beginning of a flood that will transform the tunnel system into an underwater maze with no exit signs. The veteran miners develop an almost supernatural ability to detect dangerous water accumulation through subtle changes in air pressure, humidity, and the behavior of the mine's resident rat population, which serves as an early warning system for floods in the same way they detect deadly gases, by dying first. The truly diabolical aspect of mine flooding involves the salt's interaction with water to create underground chambers that fill and empty unpredictably, like geological roulette wheels where the prize for losing is drowning in concentrated brine, while your colleagues listen helplessly from the other side of collapsed tunnel walls. These chambers can remain stable for months before suddenly releasing their contents into active mining areas with the explosive force of medieval hydraulic engineering gone horribly wrong. When flooding does occur, your escape options are limited to whatever routes aren't already underwater, blocked by debris, or occupied by other miners who had the same brilliant idea of fleeing toward the surface. The tunnel system becomes a three-dimensional maze where wrong turns lead to dead ends lead to drowning, and the correct path to safety changes constantly as water levels shift and new sections of the mine become submerged. It's like playing a video game where the level keeps changing and there are no save points. Remember that rope ladder you used to descend into this nightmare? During floods, it becomes the world's most competitive climbing challenge, with multiple miners attempting to reach the surface simultaneously while carrying whatever salt loads they can salvage and wearing waterlogged clothing that doubles their body weight. The rope, already strained by normal use, frequently snaps under the combined weight of desperate miners, sending everyone back down to join the rising water level in a lesson about medieval load-bearing calculations. The psychological terror of mine flooding extends beyond the immediate physical danger to include the knowledge that rescue attempts are limited by the same technological constraints that created the flooding problem in the first place. Medieval emergency response consisted primarily of waiting for the water to recede naturally and then sending expendable workers to count bodies and salvage equipment, in that order of priority. Your skin begins its involuntary transformation from human tissue into something resembling a medieval leather product, courtesy of salt's enthusiastic participation in the ancient art of human preservation. Within your first week underground, you'll discover that salt doesn't just season food. It seasons you, turning your body into a walking experiment in organic chemistry that would fascinate scientists if scientists existed and weren't too busy dying of plague to study occupational hazards. The process starts innocuously enough with what feels like mild sunburn, except you're hundreds of feet underground where the sun is just a theoretical concept discussed by people who still have normal skin. The salt particles floating in the mine's atmosphere settle on every exposed surface of your body, mixing with sweat to create a corrosive paste that begins eating microscopic holes in your epidermis. These tiny perforations allow more salt to penetrate deeper layers of skin, establishing a self-perpetuating cycle of chemical erosion that transforms your outer covering from protective barrier into salt absorption medium. Your hands, constantly gripping salt-encrusted tools, become the first casualties in this dermatological war. The skin cracks and splits, creating fissures that fill with salt crystals and refuse to heal properly in the mine's humid, bacteria-rich environment. Medieval miners called these salt hands, and they were considered a badge of honor among workers who survived long enough to develop them, mainly because most miners didn't survive that long. The cracks deepen daily, creating permanent channels in your flesh that serve as convenient storage spaces for additional salt deposits, turning your hands into living geological formations. The salt doesn't limit its artistic endeavors to your hands. It's an equal opportunity body modifier, Your face develops a distinctive crystalline sheen as salt deposits build up in every pore, wrinkle, and facial hair follicle. Medieval miners were easily recognizable on their rare surface visits by their salt-encrusted appearances, looking like they'd been dipped in brine and left to cure in a medieval delicatessen. The salt accumulation around your eyes creates a constant burning sensation that makes you appear to be perpetually weeping, which isn't entirely inaccurate given your current life circumstances. Historians still argue whether medieval miners were aware that prolonged salt exposure caused permanent skin damage or simply accepted disfigurement as an inevitable consequence of underground work. But contemporary medical texts describe mine skin as a condition characterized by leather-like texture, persistent cracking, and the gradual loss of normal sensitivity to pain, which actually becomes an advantage when your daily routine involves being constantly injured by sharp rocks and medieval tool technology. Your clothing becomes an extension of this preservation process, soaking up salt and moisture until your garments achieve the consistency of medieval armor made from organic materials. The fabric stiffens into rigid shapes that maintain their form even when you're not wearing them, creating a wardrobe of clothing that could theoretically stand up and work a shift without human occupancy. The salt-soaked fabric rubs constantly against your already damaged skin, creating new wounds while preventing existing ones from healing, establishing a comprehensive system of full-body abrasion that continues even during your brief rest periods. The truly fascinating aspect of this involuntary preservation process is its selectivity. Salt doesn't preserve all parts of your body equally. Your extremities, being furthest from your heart and receiving the least circulation, undergo the most dramatic changes, gradually taking on the appearance and texture of medieval jerky. Your fingers and toes become particularly artistic examples of human salt curing, developing a mummified appearance that would be impressive if it weren't attached to your living body and causing constant pain. Remember that smooth, healthy skin you had when you first descended into this mineral nightmare? Your body is systematically replacing it with something that more closely resembles the inside of a salt-cured ham, complete with the distinctive coloration and texture that medieval preservation techniques were famous for achieving in dead animals. The irony isn't lost on anyone that miners were being preserved using the same methods typically reserved for meat storage, except the meat in question was still conscious and expected to continue working. The psychological impact of watching your body transform into a salt-preserved curiosity adds another layer of horror to your underground experience. You begin avoiding reflective surfaces. Not that there are many in medieval salt mines, because seeing your gradual transformation from human to walking jerky serves as a constant reminder that you're slowly becoming a product of the same industry that's supposed to be providing your livelihood. Your sense of touch undergoes dramatic changes as nerve endings become encrusted with salt deposits, creating areas of numbness interspersed with zones of hypersensitivity where even gentle contact feels like being stabbed with tiny crystalline daggers. This sensory confusion makes it difficult to judge how tightly you're gripping tools or how much pressure you're applying to tasks, leading to accidents and injuries that compound your already extensive collection of salt-related wounds. Welcome to medieval occupational safety, where the concept of workplace protection exists only in the fevered imaginations of workers who haven't yet accepted that their job description includes expected mortality rate as a standard benefit package. Medieval safety regulations consisted of the groundbreaking principle that if something hadn't killed anyone recently, it was probably safe enough for continued use. And if it had killed someone recently, well, that person obviously wasn't being careful enough. Your introduction to mine safety protocols begins with the comprehensive training program known as Watch What Everyone Else Does and Try Not to Die While Learning. There are no safety manuals, no orientation sessions, and definitely no insurance policies. Just the time-honored tradition of pointing you toward the most dangerous section of the mine and assuming that natural selection will either toughen you up or remove you from the gene pool before you become a long-term liability. The training philosophy operates on the assumption that expensive safety measures are unnecessary when replacement workers are abundant and cheap. Cave-ins represent the mine's most creative method of worker reduction, occurring with the frequency and predictability of medieval weather patterns, which is to say they happen when they happen and usually at the worst possible moment. Medieval mining techniques involved removing as much salt as possible while leaving just enough structural support to prevent immediate collapse. A calculation that relied heavily on optimism, prayer, and the assumption that cave-ins would primarily affect expendable workers rather than valuable equipment or supervisors. The early warning system for structural instability consists entirely of listening for subtle changes in the sounds the mine makes as it slowly collapses around you. Experienced miners develop an almost musical appreciation for the different types of creaking, groaning, and settling noises that indicate various levels of imminent catastrophe. There's the gentle sighing sound that means you probably have a few hours, the sharp cracking noise that means you probably have a few minutes, and the thunderous rumbling that means you should have started running several minutes ago. Historians still argue whether medieval mine owners were genuinely ignorant of basic structural engineering principles or simply calculated that occasional cave-ins were more cost-effective than proper tunnel support. But the practical result remains the same. You're working in an environment where the ceiling could become the floor at any moment, and the floor could become a grave with very little advance notice. The support timbers used in medieval mines were selected based on availability rather than load-bearing capacity, resulting in tunnel supports that provided roughly the same structural integrity as medieval medical practices. Your daily routine includes the delightful responsibility of identifying potentially unstable sections of tunnel while simultaneously meeting salt extraction quotas that assume stable working conditions. This creates interesting moral dilemmas where you must choose between personal safety and meeting production goals. Except there's really no choice involved because failing to meet quotas results in punishment that's often more immediately dangerous than potential cave-ins. The mine's approach to hazardous gas detection represents medieval innovation at its finest. Send workers into suspicious areas and see if they come back conscious. If they return gasping and disoriented, the area probably has gas problems. If they don't return at all, the area definitely has gas problems, and also one fewer worker to worry about. This detection method doubles as a natural selection process that ensures only the most gas-resistant workers survive long enough to reproduce, theoretically creating a population of miners with enhanced tolerance for toxic atmospheres. Fire safety in a medieval salt mine presents unique challenges. Given that your only light source is actual fire and your workplace is filled with combustible gases, explosive dust, and wooden support structures that burn with the enthusiasm of medieval peasants celebrating a successful harvest. The fire prevention strategy consists primarily of hoping your torch doesn't encounter anything too flammable, and the fire suppression system consists of whatever water happens to be available, which is usually none because water in mines is typically part of a flooding crisis rather than a safety resource. Remember that sturdy rope ladder you descended on? It serves as both your primary escape route and your most likely cause of death when multiple miners attempt to use it simultaneously during emergency evacuations. The ladder wasn't designed to support the combined weight of panicked workers carrying salt loads and wearing water-soaked clothing, but medieval load calculations were more optimistic than accurate, resulting in frequent catastrophic failures during precisely the moments when the ladder's structural integrity was most crucial for survival. First aid in medieval mines consisted of whatever folk remedies the other miners remembered from their surface lives, applied with tools and materials designed for salt extraction rather than medical care. Serious injuries were treated with the medieval medical philosophy that what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, and what does kill you is probably God's will anyway. So either way, the situation resolves itself without requiring expensive medical intervention or comprehensive safety improvements. The mine's gas detection system represents the pinnacle of medieval scientific methodology. Human sacrifice disguised as quality control. Your role as the newest and most expendable member of the mining crew includes serving as a living atmospheric sensor, tasked with exploring suspicious tunnel sections to determine whether they contain deadly gases, structural instabilities, or simply new and creative ways to die that previous miners hadn't yet discovered. It's like being a medieval crash test dummy, except crash test dummies don't have to worry about their families starving if they fail to perform their duties adequately. The primary gas detection method involves what miners cheerfully call candle walking, advancing slowly into questionable areas while monitoring your torch flame for changes that indicate atmospheric problems. A bright, steady flame suggests relatively safe air. A dim, struggling flame indicates carbon dioxide buildup that will render you unconscious before you realize you're in danger. And a flame that suddenly flares blue-green means you've encountered methane and have approximately 3 seconds to decide whether you prefer dying in an explosion or spending your remaining life explaining to people why you no longer have eyebrows. Medieval miners had developed an elaborate folklore around gas detection that combined practical observation with superstition in ways that modern safety engineers would find both fascinating and horrifying. They believed that certain tunnel sections were haunted by the ghosts of previous miners who had died from gas exposure, and these spirits would warn the living by making torch flames dance in specific patterns. While this supernatural early warning system had no basis in actual ghostly intervention, it did encourage miners to pay closer attention to atmospheric changes, which occasionally prevented deaths through purely accidental scientific observation. Your secondary role as a gas detector involves monitoring your own physiological responses to atmospheric changes, learning to recognize the early symptoms of various types of poisoning before they progress to the point where recognition becomes irrelevant because you're unconscious or dead. Carbon monoxide exposure begins with mild headaches and progresses through nausea, confusion, and the irresistible urge to lie down and rest, which becomes problematic when lying down in a mine tunnel typically results in being trampled by other miners or buried under falling rocks. Historians still argue whether medieval miners were aware that their gas detection methods were essentially elaborate suicide protocols, or simply accepted high casualty rates as unavoidable consequences of underground work. But contemporary records suggest a pragmatic approach best summarized as someone has to check those tunnels, and it might as well be someone we can easily replace. The gas detection philosophy operated on the principle that losing one miner to determine tunnel safety was preferable to losing entire work crews to unexpected atmospheric hazards. The most insidious aspect of underground gas exposure involves the cumulative effects of repeated low-level poisoning that doesn't immediately kill you but gradually damages your brain, lungs, and nervous system over time. Medieval miners developed distinctive behavioral changes that surface dwellers attributed to the mysterious influences of underground work. Memory problems, personality changes, and the tendency to stare at walls for extended periods while muttering about things that weren't visible to anyone else. Modern medicine would recognize these as symptoms of chronic toxin exposure, but medieval medicine blamed them on an excess of melancholic humors and recommended bloodletting. Your torch becomes both life-saving equipment and potential execution device, depending on the atmospheric conditions you encounter during your gas detection duties. The same flame that allows you to navigate dark tunnels and identify hazardous areas can also trigger explosive reactions that transform routine safety checks into impromptu cremation services. Medieval miners learned to read torch flames with the intensity of religious scholars studying sacred texts, because misinterpreting the signs could result in spectacular deaths that would be discussed in mine folklore for generations. The mine's ecosystem of deadly gases creates a complex environmental puzzle where different tunnel sections contain different atmospheric hazards that require different survival strategies. Some areas feature carbon dioxide pockets that cause suffocation. Others contain hydrogen sulfide that burns your lungs while you're dying, and a few special sections offer exciting combinations of multiple toxic gases that compete to see which can kill you fastest. It's like a medieval chemistry set designed by someone with a very dark sense of humor and unlimited access to naturally occurring poisons. Remember that fresh air you breathed on the surface? Your lungs are developing a nostalgic relationship with normal atmospheric composition, sending increasingly desperate signals to your brain that something has gone catastrophically wrong with your environmental choices. The gas detection process involves deliberately exposing yourself to atmospheric conditions that range from merely harmful to immediately lethal, creating an occupational specialty that combines the excitement of Russian roulette with the career stability of medieval plague research. Your stomach experiences the culinary adventure of a lifetime as you discover what medieval nutritionists would have classified as food if medieval nutritionists existed and weren't too busy dying of various dietary deficiencies to establish professional standards. Underground dining in salt mines represents the intersection of limited resources, questionable preservation methods, and the philosophical question of how little nutrition a human body requires before it stops being technically human and becomes something more closely resembling animated jerky. Your daily meal allowance consists of bread that achieves the consistency of medieval building materials, having been baked weeks ago and stored in conditions that would make rats reconsider their life choices. The bread's texture ranges from aggressively chewy to potentially useful as emergency tunnel support, depending on humidity levels and how long it's been exposed to the mine's atmospheric conditions. Medieval bakers didn't worry about expiration dates because spoilage was considered a natural flavor enhancement, adding character and texture to otherwise boring grain products. The ale provided for miners serves multiple purposes: beverage, calorie source, and antiseptic for wounds that won't heal properly in the mine's bacteria-rich environment. Medieval brewing techniques produced alcohol with enough potency to sterilize medical instruments, assuming medical instruments existed in salt mines, which they didn't because injured miners were expected to heal naturally or contribute to the mine's impressive collection of educational skeletons. The ale's alcohol content makes it safer to drink than water while simultaneously making it easier to ignore the various ways your body is systematically breaking down under mining conditions. Your protein sources come from whatever small animals can be caught in the mine tunnels, plus the occasional delivery of salt pork that's been preserved using the same methods currently being applied to your living body. The rats that inhabit the mine represent both pest control problems and emergency protein supplements, creating an interesting ecosystem where you're simultaneously hunting your dinner and competing with your dinner for the same food sources. Medieval miners developed sophisticated trapping techniques that doubled as entertainment during their brief rest periods between shifts. Historians still argue whether medieval mine owners deliberately provided inadequate nutrition to keep workers weak and compliant or simply didn't understand the connection between food quality and worker productivity. But the practical effect remains the same. You're operating heavy medieval machinery while suffering from malnutrition, dehydration, and whatever medieval medicine would eventually classify as mining-related dietary disorders. The economic calculations were straightforward. Feeding miners adequately cost more than replacing malnourished ones. The underground storage conditions create a natural laboratory for studying food decomposition under controlled conditions of high humidity, variable temperature, and complete darkness. Your food supplies develop interesting microbial ecosystems that transform simple bread and preserved meat into complex biological experiments that would fascinate scientists if scientists weren't too busy dealing with plague outbreaks to study occupational nutrition. The mold growing on your bread becomes a dietary supplement whether you want it or not. Cooking facilities in medieval salt mines consist of whatever fire sources can be maintained safely in an environment filled with combustible gases and explosive dust. Most food preparation involves eating things cold or finding creative ways to warm them using torch flames without triggering mine-wide conflagrations. The cooking process requires balancing nutritional needs against fire safety, usually by prioritizing fire safety and accepting that cold, moldy bread is preferable to being roasted alive in an underground oven of your own creation. Your dining schedule revolves around the mine's operational requirements rather than normal human digestion patterns. creating metabolic chaos that medieval physicians would have attributed to displaced humors, but modern medicine recognizes as chronic malnutrition complicated by irregular eating patterns and occupational stress. You eat when work permits, sleep when exhaustion demands, and gradually develop the distinctive gaunt appearance that marks veteran miners as clearly as their salt-encrusted skin and permanent respiratory problems. Water sources in the mine present interesting challenges for beverage selection. The same water that might flood the tunnels and drown you also serves as your primary drinking supply when it's not actively trying to kill you through drowning. The water's high mineral content creates a natural electrolyte replacement system that helps offset some of the salt losses from constant sweating. Assuming you can access the water without falling into underground streams or triggering flooding events that transform your workplace into an underwater maze. Remember that normal relationship your digestive system had with regular meals, proper nutrition, and food that wasn't actively decomposing? Your stomach is filing formal complaints with your brain about the dramatic changes in dining standards, sending increasingly desperate signals that something has gone wrong with your food procurement strategies, and perhaps it's time to reconsider your career choices before your internal organs stage a complete revolt against your life decisions. The social dynamics of your underground workplace make medieval court politics look like a friendly neighborhood barbecue, creating an environment where interpersonal relationships are measured in survival value rather than personal compatibility. You're entering a complex ecosystem of human interaction where trust is a luxury that can get you killed. Friendship is a strategic alliance that might save your life, and enemies are simply colleagues who haven't found the right opportunity to eliminate you yet. Your relationship with fellow miners operates on the principle of competitive cooperation. You need each other to survive the mine's various attempts to kill you, but you're also competing for limited resources, safer work assignments, and the attention of supervisors who might promote you out of the most dangerous jobs. This creates fascinating psychological dynamics where you're simultaneously dependent on and threatened by the same people, leading to friendships that resemble military alliances more than normal social relationships. The veteran miners treat new arrivals with the warmth typically reserved for people carrying contagious diseases, which isn't entirely unfair since new miners represent additional competition for resources while possessing none of the skills necessary to contribute meaningfully to group survival efforts. They've developed an elaborate hazing process that combines practical education with deliberate psychological abuse, teaching you essential survival skills while simultaneously testing whether you have the mental fortitude to survive long enough to make learning those skills worthwhile. Mine supervisors occupy a unique position in the social hierarchy. They're responsible for maintaining discipline and productivity while being universally hated by everyone under their authority. They've learned to sleep with weapons and travel in groups because solitary supervisors have a tendency to suffer mysterious accidents in dark tunnels where witness testimony becomes unreliable and evidence tends to get buried under convenient rock falls. The supervision philosophy operates on the principle that fear is more effective than respect for maintaining order among workers who have very little left to lose. Historians still argue whether medieval mine social structures developed organically from working conditions or were deliberately designed to prevent worker organization and rebellion, but the effect remains the same. You're surrounded by people who might save your life or end it, depending on circumstances that change as frequently as mine safety conditions. The social environment creates constant psychological stress that compounds the physical dangers of underground work. Your interactions with visiting nobility provide entertainment for everyone involved, though not necessarily the enjoyable kind. When lords and their entourages make their ceremonial inspections of mining operations, they arrive with armed guards, scented handkerchiefs, and the kind of wide-eyed fascination that people display when visiting exotic animals at medieval menageries. These visits create temporary disruptions in normal mine operations as supervisors frantically attempt to make brutal working conditions appear merely unpleasant, while miners are expected to perform their duties with enthusiasm rather than their usual combination of resignation and barely contained homicidal rage. The underground community develops its own informal economy based on bartering skills, favors, and information rather than currency. Since monetary transactions become somewhat theoretical when your life expectancy is measured in months. You might trade your expertise in identifying unstable tunnel sections for someone else's knowledge of which supervisors can be bribed and which ones prefer solving problems through creative applications of violence. This creates complex webs of mutual obligation that can either provide crucial support networks or become elaborate revenge schemes that play out over time. Conflict resolution in mine communities follows medieval justice principles adapted for underground conditions. Disputes are settled through combat, intimidation, or arranging for your opponent to suffer convenient accidents during hazardous work assignments. The justice system operates on the assumption that might makes right, and right makes for longer survival, creating a social environment where physical strength and psychological ruthlessness are more valuable than moral character or ethical behavior. Your sleeping arrangements reinforce social hierarchies through proximity to various mine hazards. New miners sleep closest to tunnel entrances where they're first to respond to emergencies, while veteran workers claim sleeping spots deeper underground where they're safer from external threats but more vulnerable to cave-ins and flooding. The dormitory politics involve complex negotiations over sleeping positions that balance safety concerns against status considerations and practical access to escape routes. Remember that normal social environment where relationships were based on shared interests, mutual respect, and genuine affection? Your underground community operates on entirely different principles where social bonds are forged through shared trauma, maintained through mutual necessity, and dissolved through death, betrayal, or the simple recognition that someone else's survival might conflict with your own long-term prospects for avoiding becoming another cautionary skeleton in the mine's growing collection of workplace safety demonstrations. Your body becomes a living medical textbook illustrating every occupational disease that medieval physicians couldn't properly diagnose, treat, or understand, but could certainly describe in colorful detail using terminology that blamed your suffering on everything from displaced humors to divine punishment for unspecified moral failings. Welcome to the comprehensive healthcare system known as Die Quietly and Don't Complain Too Much because it disturbs the other workers who are also dying but haven't reached the noisy stage yet. The signature affliction of salt mining, affectionately known as miner's lung, begins as a slight cough and progresses through increasingly dramatic stages of respiratory failure until you're essentially drowning in your own bodily fluids while surrounded by people who are too busy developing their own versions of the same disease to offer much sympathy. Your lungs gradually transform from efficient oxygen-processing organs into salt-encrusted storage containers that wheeze, rattle, and occasionally produce bloody foam that medieval medicine interprets as evidence of excess sanguine humors requiring immediate bloodletting. The constant inhalation of salt particles creates microscopic cuts throughout your respiratory system, providing convenient entry points for the mine's impressive collection of airborne bacteria, fungi, and other microorganisms that medieval science can't identify but your immune system recognizes as hostile invaders. Your breathing becomes a symphony of unnatural sounds, whistling, crackling, and wet gurgling noises that serve as audio indicators of your internal organs' gradual transition from functional biological systems to decorative medical curiosities. Miner's Curse represents the mine's most mysterious contribution to medieval medical literature, a condition characterized by progressive weakness, mental confusion, and the gradual loss of motor control that transforms competent workers into shambling shadows of their former selves. Modern medicine would recognize this as heavy metal poisoning combined with chronic malnutrition and respiratory failure, but medieval physicians attributed it to underground demons, cursed salt deposits, or the general moral failings of people who chose to work in mines instead of pursuing more respectable careers like dying of plague. Historians still argue whether medieval mine owners were aware that their operations created specific health hazards or simply accepted worker mortality as an inevitable cost of doing business. but contemporary medical records suggest a pragmatic approach best summarized as sick workers who can't work don't get fed, and dead workers don't require medical attention. The healthcare philosophy operated on the principle that prevention was expensive while replacement workers were abundant and cheap. Your skin conditions progress from simple salt burns to elaborate dermatological art projects that would fascinate medical students if medical students existed and had access to educational materials beyond whatever folk remedies their professors remembered from their own apprenticeships. The salt-induced wounds refuse to heal properly in the mind's humid environment, developing into permanent fixtures that serve as conversation starters and warning examples for newer miners who haven't yet accepted that their bodies are gradually becoming salt-cured exhibitions of occupational hazard effects. The psychological effects of chronic pain, sleep deprivation, and social isolation combine to create what medieval physicians called underground madness, a condition characterized by hallucinations, paranoia, and the tendency to have conversations with mining equipment that appears to be responding intelligently. Your mental state deteriorates in predictable stages. First, you start talking to yourself, then you start talking to inanimate objects, and finally you start getting answers that seem perfectly reasonable given your circumstances. Digestive disorders become routine features of underground life as your stomach rebels against a diet consisting primarily of moldy bread, questionable water, and whatever protein sources can be caught, killed, and consumed without triggering food poisoning severe enough to prevent you from meeting daily salt extraction quotas. Medieval gastroenterology consisted of recommending prayer, fasting, and the consumption of blessed water that had been exposed to holy relics, none of which proved particularly effective against occupational malnutrition and chronic mineral poisoning. Your musculoskeletal system undergoes dramatic changes as constant heavy labor in cramped conditions gradually reshapes your skeleton into something more closely resembling medieval garden tools than normal human bone structure. The distinctive hunched posture of veteran miners develops from years of working in tunnels too low for upright posture, creating permanent spinal deformities that serve as visual indicators of someone who's survived long enough in the mines to achieve senior worker status. Remember that healthy, properly functioning body you had before descending into this medical nightmare? Your various organ systems are filing formal complaints with whatever medieval equivalent of workers' compensation might theoretically exist, though those complaints are being processed by the same administrative system that considered your current working conditions acceptable in the first place. Your body is systematically documenting every health hazard associated with medieval salt, mining through the time-honored research method of experiencing them personally and hoping someone survives long enough to pass the information along to future generations. The truly remarkable aspect of minor health problems is their cumulative nature. Each individual condition might be survivable, but the combination of respiratory disease, skin disorders, digestive problems, psychological trauma, and musculoskeletal damage creates a comprehensive medical catastrophe that medieval medicine is entirely unprepared to address through any method more sophisticated than recommending prayer and preparing family members for funeral arrangements. Your economic value has been precisely calculated by people who've never held a pickaxe, and the results would be depressing if they weren't so fascinatingly medieval in their brutal efficiency. Welcome to the dawn of industrial capitalism, where human resources are treated as actual resources, renewable, replaceable, and subject to the same cost-benefit analyses typically applied to livestock, except livestock receives better housing and medical care because dead cows are immediately obvious while dead miners can work for several days before anyone notices they've stopped breathing. The mathematics of medieval mining economics operate on principles that would make modern accountants weep with professional admiration while simultaneously filing complaints with whatever ethical oversight bodies might theoretically exist. Your replacement cost has been calculated at approximately 3 months' wages for a skilled craftsman, which sounds reasonable until you realize that your life expectancy is approximately 6 months. meaning the mine owner recovers his investment with 100% profit margins that would be impressive in any industry that didn't involve literally working people to death. Salt prices in medieval markets fluctuate between worth more than silver and worth more than human life, creating interesting economic dynamics where your daily salt extraction quota represents more monetary value than your annual salary. Assuming you survive long enough to collect an annual salary rather than contributing to the mine's impressive collection of educational corpses. The economic calculations are straightforward. 1 pound of salt equals 1 week of miner wages. One miner produces approximately 50 pounds of salt per week, and one miner costs approximately 3 pounds of salt to feed in-house, resulting in profit margins that would make medieval merchants weep with joy. Your position in the mining economy represents the intersection of feudal labor practices with early capitalist exploitation, creating a system where you're simultaneously a serf bound to the land, a wage laborer earning monetary compensation, and a disposable resource subject to replacement when economic conditions make disposal more profitable than maintenance. This trifecta of economic exploitation ensures that you experience the worst aspects of every labor system humanity has devised while enjoying the benefits of none of them. Historians still argue whether medieval mine owners were consciously developing exploitative labor practices or simply responding to market forces that made human exploitation the most profitable business model. But the practical effect remains the same. You're working in an industry where worker mortality is factored into quarterly profit projections alongside equipment maintenance costs and tunnel expansion budgets. The economic philosophy operates on the principle that workers who survive long enough to develop expertise become expensive, while dead workers require no ongoing investment. The mine's accounting system tracks worker productivity, equipment costs, and salt output with medieval precision while maintaining no records whatsoever of worker mortality, injury rates, or long-term health effects because tracking negative externalities would interfere with profit calculations. Your death will be recorded as natural causes regardless of whether you're crushed by falling rocks, drowned in flooding, or succumb to any of the mine's creative disease vectors, because acknowledging workplace causality would create legal liability that medieval law isn't equipped to handle. Your salary, when it exists at all, is paid in a combination of currency, food rations, and housing credits that ensure you remain financially dependent on the mine while providing just enough compensation to prevent outright rebellion. The payment system operates on the principle that workers who can afford to leave will leave, while workers who can't afford to leave will work until they're no longer physically capable of working, at which point they become someone else's problem through the miracle of medieval social services, which consist primarily of hoping charity organizations or family members will handle the disposal of worn-out laborers. The broader economic impact of medieval salt mining creates regional prosperity built on foundations of human suffering that would be morally troubling if medieval economics included moral considerations in business planning, which they didn't because morality was considered the responsibility of religious authorities, while business was considered the responsibility of people who understood that profit margins were more important than theological concerns. The salt trade generates wealth that supports entire communities, creating economic ecosystems where everyone from merchants to nobility benefits from mining operations while maintaining plausible deniability about the methods used to produce their prosperity. Remember that concept of fair wages for honest work? Your labor relationship operates under economic principles that predate the development of concepts like workers' rights, safe working conditions, and the radical notion that people who produce valuable commodities should share in the profits generated by their efforts. The mining economy represents pure extraction capitalism where natural resources and human resources are processed with equal efficiency and similar concern for long-term sustainability, which is to say none whatsoever because medieval economics operated on quarterly thinking that assumed unlimited supplies of both salt deposits and replacement workers. Your dreams of escape begin forming the moment you realize that staying means certain death while leaving means probable death, creating the kind of life choice that medieval philosophers would have used as examples of divine testing if medieval philosophers weren't too busy escaping from various unpleasant situations to develop comprehensive theories about human suffering. The escape planning process involves balancing your fear of remaining in the mine against your terror of whatever awaits you beyond the mine's boundaries, which in medieval Europe includes wolves, bandits, starvation, exposure, and creative punishment methods that make salt mining look like a recreational activity. Your first escape fantasy involves simply walking away during a surface delivery run, except you quickly realize that medieval labor contracts were enforced through methods that made modern collection agencies look like charitable organizations staffed by kindly grandmothers. Runaway miners were pursued by professional trackers who specialized in returning human property to their rightful owners, and these trackers were compensated based on successful recoveries rather than the condition of recovered workers, creating interesting incentives that prioritized retrieval over preservation of life and limb. The surrounding wilderness presents escape challenges that would discourage modern survival experts equipped with GPS devices, emergency beacons, and comprehensive outdoor training. You're facing medieval forests populated by wolves that haven't learned to fear humans, bears that consider medieval miners a convenient protein source, and bandits who view escaped serfs as walking sources of entertainment, labor, and whatever meager possessions desperate people carry when fleeing from situations they consider worse than death. The wildlife management philosophy of medieval Europe operated on the principle that dangerous animals served useful functions in controlling human population growth and discouraging unauthorized travel. Your knowledge of navigation consists of whatever geographical information you've absorbed during your brief surface visits, which amounts to knowing that the mine entrance faces roughly toward the sunrise and the nearest village is somewhere in the direction of the sunset. Assuming the sunset you observed wasn't blocked by mountains, forests, or other geographical features that medieval cartography hadn't yet learned to represent accurately on maps that existed primarily in the imaginations of people who'd never traveled more than a few miles from their birthplaces. Historians still argue whether medieval authorities deliberately made escape difficult to prevent labor shortages or simply maintained harsh penalties for runaway workers as part of general social control policies. But the practical effect remains the same. Successful escape requires evading professional trackers, surviving wilderness hazards, and avoiding recapture by communities that received bounties for returning missing workers to their original locations. The legal philosophy operated on the principle that people who attempted to escape their assigned social positions were challenging the natural order established by divine authority and required correction through methods that would discourage similar attempts. The punishment system for captured escapees represents medieval creativity at its most imaginative, featuring disciplinary measures designed to serve as educational experiences for other workers while providing entertainment for supervisors who'd grown bored with routine mining operations. Punishments ranged from public beatings that left permanent disabilities to creative applications of medieval technology that transformed human bodies into warning examples for anyone else considering unauthorized career changes. The punishment philosophy emphasized spectacle over efficiency, because visible consequences were more effective deterrents than private disciplinary measures. Your escape preparations must account for seasonal considerations that add additional layers of complexity to wilderness survival planning. Winter escape attempts involve freezing temperatures, limited food sources, and the increased likelihood of encountering wolves whose hunting success rates improve dramatically when their prey includes undernourished humans wearing inadequate clothing and lacking survival skills. Summer escapes offer better weather conditions but increased risk of encounters with bandits, traveling merchants who might report runaway workers to local authorities, and various seasonal diseases that medieval medicine treats through methods that often prove more dangerous than the original illnesses. The psychological barriers to escape often prove more challenging than physical obstacles because months of underground work gradually erode the mental resilience necessary for major life decisions that involve significant personal risk. Your decision-making capacity has been compromised by chronic malnutrition, sleep deprivation, and constant exposure to life-threatening situations that create learned helplessness patterns where accepting terrible conditions seems safer than risking unknown alternatives that might prove even worse. Remember that optimistic person who believed in personal agency and the possibility of improving your life circumstances through individual effort? Your experience in the mines has provided comprehensive education in the limitations of personal autonomy within economic systems designed to prevent upward mobility or lateral movement away from assigned social positions. Escape planning becomes an exercise in weighing known horrors against unknown dangers while operating with compromised judgment and limited resources in an environment specifically designed to make departure impossible through legal, economic, and physical constraints that create what medieval social theorists would have called natural order. If medieval social theorists existed and weren't too busy avoiding their own assigned social positions. Your final reckoning arrives not with dramatic fanfare but with the quiet inevitability of medieval mathematics, where human lifespans are calculated with the same precision used for crop yields and livestock mortality rates. The statistics surrounding medieval salt mining read like a mathematical proof that demonstrates why optimism was considered a luxury item unavailable to working-class consumers. Average life expectancy for miners was 28 years, assuming they started working at age 16 and managed to avoid the mine's more immediate methods of employee termination. The actuarial tables, if medieval insurance companies had existed and weren't too busy dying of plague to develop comprehensive risk assessment models, would have classified salt miners alongside professional soldiers, plague doctors, and people whose careers involved regular interaction with hungry wild animals. Your odds of seeing your 30th birthday are roughly equivalent to surviving a medieval military campaign, except military campaigns eventually end while salt mining continues until death provides the only available retirement plan. The cause of death statistics reveal the mine's impressive diversity in worker elimination methods: 30% cave-ins, 25% respiratory failure, 20% flooding, 15% gas poisoning, and 10% miscellaneous creative fatalities that medieval coroners classified under acts of divine will, because acknowledging workplace causality would have required safety improvements that cut into profit margins. The remaining miners simply disappeared into the deeper tunnel systems, joining the mine's permanent resident population of people who went to work one day and never returned to collect their final paychecks. Your body's gradual deterioration follows predictable patterns documented by medieval physicians who studied mining communities with the clinical detachment of scientists observing natural phenomena beyond human intervention. The progression begins with respiratory symptoms, advances through skin conditions and digestive disorders, and culminates in the comprehensive organ failure that medieval medicine attributed to mining humors. Toxic influences that supposedly corrupted the natural balance of bodily fluids through prolonged exposure to underground environments. Historians still argue whether medieval society was aware of mining mortality rates or simply accepted high worker death rates as inevitable consequences of extracting valuable commodities from dangerous environments. But contemporary records suggest that everyone involved understood the risks, while maintaining the fiction that salt mining was just another form of agricultural labor that happened to occur underground. The social philosophy operated on the principle that acknowledging workplace mortality would require addressing workplace mortality, which was economically inconvenient. The mine's legacy system ensures that your replacement is already working alongside you, learning the skills necessary to fill your position when you become unavailable due to death, disability, or disappearance into tunnel systems that may or may not lead to exit points. The training program operates on principles of natural selection where successful miners develop the specific combination of physical resilience, psychological adaptation, and luck necessary to survive longer than their statistical life expectancy, while unsuccessful miners provide educational experiences for their replacements. Your final contribution to the mine's operations involves whatever salt extraction you manage to accomplish before joining the permanent underground population that medieval miners called the Deep Residents. Workers who went down but never came back up, either because they died in place or became so adapted to underground life that surface existence seemed impossible. These deep residents serve important functions as cautionary examples, navigation aids for tunnel systems, and sources of equipment that can be salvaged once decomposition reaches appropriate stages. The records-keeping system ensures that your existence will be documented in ledger books that track salt production, equipment costs, and worker turnover with medieval precision while maintaining no information about worker names, family relationships, or individual circumstances because personalizing economic statistics would interfere with the emotional detachment necessary for efficient business operations. Your death will be recorded as a single mark in the worker replacement required column alongside notations about pickaxe maintenance and tunnel support repairs. Remember that person who descended into the mine with hopes, dreams, and the naive expectation that hard work would lead to eventual improvement in life circumstances? The mathematical reality of medieval salt mining demonstrates that individual effort, personal character, and divine favor are irrelevant variables in equations where the only significant factors are economic efficiency and geological hazards. Your story ends not with heroic struggle against impossible odds, but with quiet acceptance of statistical inevitability in an industry designed to consume human resources as efficiently as it processes natural resources. The darkness of the tunnels gradually becomes less oppressive as your eyes close for the final time, and the sounds of pickaxes striking stone fade into a distant rhythm that might be other miners continuing their work, or might be the pulse of your own heart slowing to match the eternal patience of salt deposits that have waited millions of years and can wait a few million more. The cold seeps through your salt-encrusted clothing, through your preserved skin, into bones that have become as much mineral as organic matter, until you achieve the perfect preservation that salt has always provided to things that no longer move, no longer breathe, no longer dream of seeing sunlight again. And so your journey into the depths ends as all such journeys must, with the gentle inevitability of sleep overtaking exhaustion. Let the harsh sounds of medieval mining fade into the soft whisper of pages turning, the crack of pickaxe on salt becoming the distant settling of your house at night. The torch flames flicker and dim into the warm glow of streetlights beyond your window, and the oppressive darkness of tunnels transforms into the comfortable darkness of your own safe room. You can feel your breathing slow and deepen, no longer labored with salt dust but clear and easy in the clean air that surrounds you now. Your muscles relax into soft bedding that bears no resemblance to straw pallets on cave floors, and your skin remembers what it feels like to be free of crystalline crusts and mineral deposits. The statistics and mortality rates drift away like numbers written in salt that dissolve in the gentle humidity of peaceful sleep. The medieval world recedes into the past where it belongs, taking its brutal economics and impossible survival challenges with it, leaving behind only the satisfaction of having explored human resilience without having to actually experience medieval working conditions. Your modern life waits patiently for tomorrow, with its indoor plumbing, occupational safety regulations, and refreshing absence of deadly atmospheric conditions or cave-in statistics. Close your eyes and let the weight of history settle into dreams where you can observe the past without living it, where knowledge replaces experience and comfort replaces survival. The mine shafts collapse behind you as consciousness fades, sealing away the dangers of medieval labor practices and leaving only the warm, safe darkness of restorative sleep. Sweet dreams, knowing that your deepest descent tonight is into peaceful slumber rather than salt-crusted tunnels, and your morning ascent will be into sunlight rather than statistical improbability.